Well, hello everyone. Welcome to the inaugural episode of the Bants and the Belfry podcast, hosted by yours truly. First of all, big shout out to Continentalist, who came up with the title. Definitely an improvement on the one that we actually both came up with independently, which was going to be Hot Gossip. I think I just decided in the end, just saying that made me feel too weird. I felt like I was just continually lisping. So for this first episode, well, actually, let's start at the beginning. I've been getting hassled a lot to do a podcast, just by people who I suppose are like, "Wow, you talk a lot of shit. Maybe you should try doing that more." And so I eventually caved, and this is what it looks like. My idea for the podcast is just that I will try and track down people who are either goths or have some kind of intersection with the goth community / subculture, and who are doing things that basically I find interesting to talk about. And so for this first episode, I've gotten hold of a friend of mine called Matt Macdonald, who is doing his philosophy PhD at Harvard University. I've known Matt for about 10 years. I think he can correct me on this if I'm wrong, but I think I first met him when he was dating my ex-wife, maybe around 2010. I have a memory of them kind of coming around to my flat, and he was this very attractive, very shy, very quiet boy, who had a lot to say about philosophy and other interesting things. And he's done a lot of interesting things with his life, and I find what he's doing now particularly interesting. So I've got him on here, and we're going to have a chat for an hour or two, just about various things. In terms of housekeeping, one thing I will need to point out is that I am streaming this podcast live on Twitch, but because I have to kind of, focus on the guest, I won't really be able to interact with the chat. However, if you have any questions for Matt, if you can whisper them to me, we'll get to them probably at the end. And have I said enough things? I think that's probably enough things. So let's crack on. Let's cross our fingers that the technical failure that is almost certain fails to instantiate itself. And let's shift now over to Matt Macdonald. Matt Macdonald.
Hello.
Hello.
Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you okay. Sound quality is sort of adequate. So perhaps the first thing is, was I right about the way that we met? Had we met before you started going out with Lindley?
I think that's right. And yeah, I think it was probably about 10 years ago or so, maybe even longer than that.
It feels like longer, but in a good way. I record, and well, the other thing that I also failed to mention is that we lived together for, I don't know, like a year or two, something like that. When you were studying, you were doing, I guess, your bachelor's of philosophy at Victoria University. Is that what you were doing?
Yeah. So I was doing a bachelor in psychology and philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
It would have been, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, I think.
Yeah, I do remember you being extraordinarily studious. You also had the smallest room in the house, and you spent a lot of time in there reading and studying. And I would like to take this opportunity now to apologize for all the band practices that you had to endure. Particularly the songs that took us a long time to get right, that you probably just heard the same sort of bridge about 30 or 40 times in a row while you're trying to concentrate on, Kant or Hegel or whomever.
I was wondering whether your songs were just deliberately super repetitive or not, but
no, we were.
No, that was fine.
We were just super incompetent at doing that. So when I was trying to think of guests for the show, you were one of the first person who sprung to mind, because it's here's someone kind of a goth doing something pretty cool that not a lot of people can say that they've done, which is to be doing their PhD in philosophy at an Ivy League university in the United States. And And so I was thinking sort of how to approach that. When I talked to Freya about it, she's like, just don't talk too much about other stuff, like jump straight into the philosophy. And I sort of debated that, but I thought I'd like to do a little bit of scene setting first, in terms of you. So I suppose my first question is, how did you first become interested in philosophy?
I think it started when I was studying psychology, and I was sort of doing philosophy kind of on the side as like an interest paper.
Yeah.
And it took a while for me to decide to just like make the full shift over to like specializing in philosophy.
Right.
I think the reason why I kind of got interested in it was like I remember we were doing like we were studying some stuff in psychology, which had sort of like really, I guess maybe deep implications for like how we understand like ourselves and the world and sort of, human nature and stuff like that. But we were kind of coming at it from like a very, like, I guess, I'm not sure how to describe it, but just like the approach from which they were coming at it in psychology was, it just seemed to me kind of like unfulfilling or unsatisfying. So like, I'll give you an example. Like in cases of severe epilepsy, there used to be this treatment where they would like sever the connections that join the two hemispheres of the brain together.
Right.
And you get all these really interesting results when you do that. Like, for example, if you ask someone to reach for something, they might like reach with both hands or something, and like in a way of like conflicting. Or if you show something in like one visual field, it won't carry over to like the other side of the brain because you've got like sort of two spheres of information processing going on. And so this kind of like raised for me like this interesting, I guess, like a philosophical question of like, do we have like two spheres of consciousness here, or is it or is consciousness kind of divisible or whatever? And sort of all these questions about like the nature of the mind and like the nature of the nature of the self and stuff like that, which were, I guess, like distinctively philosophical questions. But the way it was being studied in psychology was like kind of not really focusing on that, which was fine. I mean, yeah, it was totally fine, but it sort of made me think that maybe I was in kind of the wrong path.
Right.
And so I kind of made this full shift to philosophy to focus on like, just these kinds of like deep questions about, our minds, the world, and stuff like that.
Right. Brilliant. Yes. So it was basically the lack of satisfying explanations in the domain of psychology to what you felt were essentially philosophical questions that you were encountering as a result of your study of psychology, and that made you decide that you were going to focus your time and energy on philosophy from that point on, right?
Yeah, I mean, I was also just like much better at doing philosophy than I was at doing psychology.
Well, it doesn't hurt, right?
Like I was kind of terrible at like doing statistics and research methods and stuff like that.
Right.
So I just realized that a change of track was better suited to like what I was good at.
And so you finished your bachelor's, is that right? And I think you were getting some articles published and stuff at the time. Did you do honors?
Yeah, I did honors and masters in Wellington, and then like took some time off before applying for grad school.
And how did you come to end up at Harvard?
Well, basically what I did was I just applied for a bunch of places. Like sort of the way grad school works in philosophy is there's like a massive surplus of talented people. And like not enough PhD positions for them.
Right.
Especially because like the really good graduate schools will only accept people if they can also give them scholarships. So it's kind of, there are just not enough positions to go around. So basically the way you like have to do it to do grad school in philosophy is to just apply to like 10 or 20 places, sometimes multiple times, and just kind of cross your fingers.
Mm-hmm.
Like being really good at it isn't really like enough to guarantee that you'll get in. So I just applied for like a whole lot of places, kind of didn't really expect like very much, but I thought, there's no harm in just kind of going for it. And then like I went and got like a regular job and kind of forgot about it and sort of thought, okay, well, I sent out my applications, but it's probably going to come to nothing. Time to sort of move on with my life.
Right.
But then I got accepted, and it was kind of out of the blue a little bit.
Mm-hmm. And what were you? I mean, beyond being good at philosophy, which I assume is the kind of baseline prerequisite, I seem to recall that you were doing a bunch of things kind of on top, right? Which I imagine would have helped you. Like you were running the philosophy club at Victoria University. You were writing articles and getting them published in journals. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, that all kind of looks good on your application. And plus, you are from the extremely foreign and exotic island of New Zealand. So you have that going for you too. And yeah, I mean, it's an impressive thing to have accomplished. And how are you finding? Well, obviously this is the other thing I kind of meant to mention about you is that you've been completely locked down pretty much, haven't you, over COVID? And
yeah. So basically what happened was because I'm normally based in Boston. I'm back in Wellington right now, but normally I'm based in Boston because of my studies. And when the COVID situation really flared up back in March, like the university and most of the universities over there just like sent all the students home, moved all the classes online, and that's pretty much how it's been since then.
Right.
Also, like in Massachusetts, there was a lockdown for, I guess, I don't know, maybe like a month or something. But then even after that, like a lot of people were still kind of working from home, and like a lot of like bars and restaurants weren't reopening. And, also just like no one would want to hang out for obvious reasons, like for good reason. So I've basically just kind of been in my room for like the past 8 or 9 months, just about.
Yeah. And decided to come back home for, well, I don't know, until, I suppose at least until the situation's sorted out to the point that people can travel freely between countries again, right?
Yeah. It sort of got to the point where I thought, I might as well just like come back to New Zealand.
Which does mean you're having to keep some odd hours at the moment.
Yeah, so I'm still teaching at Harvard. I'm teaching at 9 a.m. Eastern time, which works out to like 3 a.m. New Zealand time.
Right.
So basically just being fully nocturnal, just about.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose as a goth, you probably the nocturnalism isn't perhaps as hard on you as it might be on some other people.
Yeah.
Right. Oh, well, that's cool. So I think that's enough of kind of, who is Matt? How did he get here? What is he doing? And I'm interested to sort of talk to you about philosophy, and particularly I'm interested in hearing you talk about the philosophical problems that have interested you in the past and the ones that you're kind of currently thinking about and working on. Just give us a taste of that, Mr. Macdonald.
So mostly what I started out with in philosophy was epistemology. So that's like the theory of knowledge, theory of like rationality, and like how can we have like accurate and reliable beliefs about the world. So, and also like how should we respond in cases of like, deep disagreement about like ethical matters or these kinds of irresolvable kinds of disagreements and stuff. So that's epistemology, and that's kind of what I started out in. But I moved, after a while, I kind of moved in the direction of doing more like political philosophy. So thinking about things like deep ethical disagreement, for example, from the perspective of like how can we overcome things like polarization.
Mm-hmm.
So what I'm doing at the moment is really kind of at the intersection of like epistemology and political philosophy.
Right.
What I'm currently researching is mostly stuff to do with misinformation.
Right. Which there is certainly no shortage of in the world at this time. So what are your kind of what are your sort of thoughts around those things? Like, what do you think the root of the actually I was going to say of like the apparent polarization, but it's more than apparent because there's been plenty of research that demonstrates that no, you're right. There is actually like an increased level of political polarization, versus because there have been institutes like tracking it, right? So if you look at the graphs, the poles are further apart, and there are more people under the kind of the means of each sort of distribution. So, what are your thoughts about why that's happened, and what are your thoughts around any kind of potential solutions that might exist that perhaps philosophy can sort of help people with?
So the video is just cutting out. Can you still see and hear me okay?
I can see and hear you okay. It has been a little bit jerky at times, but mostly it's the voice at least is fine, which is the main thing.
Gotcha. Cool. Yeah, so I guess, polarization is like a really complicated problem because it's kind of, it's because you've got like sort of background social psychological causes which make us prone to like thinking in very sort of tribal group oriented terms. Right. So that's like one strand of it. But then you have like institutional structures like legal systems and media systems and stuff like that, which are kind of tailored to really amplifying the degree of polarization in like political or ethical discourse generally. And then you also have misinformation, which is like a third thing that's like actively kind of exaggerating or amplifying that.
Well, yeah,
and then, some people have looked also at like social media as like a thing that kind of promotes echo chambers. Mm-hmm. So that's to say communities of people who pretty much think the same way and in a way that's kind of shut off from opposing influences and in a way that's kind of self-amplifying.
That's right.
But I think that's actually, I think that kind of technological explanation is actually less important than the other three. Well, so I can talk about any of those if you want.
No, I'm very interested in hearing you talk about all of them actually. But I was going to say, in terms of there being increased polarization in the world, I suppose what you're most interested in what's changed, right? So how is the world different from 30, 40 years ago? And in my view, in my reckon, I think about the information diet that I used to have as a kid, or that my parents would have had most of their lives, right? Which was you might get the paper every day and spend, let's say, 30 minutes to an hour reading that. Plenty of people wouldn't. And then you might have a half hour or an hour news bulletin at night. And, that's the kind of, for most people, that would be the bulk of the kind of news and political information that they would get. And it certainly seems to me that quite a lot has changed between then and now in terms of the way we acquire information that helps us to make sense of the world, right? That we can, as you've just pointed out, that you can have your social media channels, you can cultivate your feed, so you only see views that you agree with. You can have a constant drip, drip, drip feed of it, like the dopamine all day long. You can just doom scroll on it, which does have that self-reinforcing effect, right? You double down on your own views. You're engaged in facilitating the doubling down of other people in their views. And the fact that the levels of polarization have increased, I'm interested in the fact that you don't see that as the main reason for the change in the levels of polarization. So how would you talk to that kind of observation?
Well, one part of it is to look at the effects of just like pure scale on media structures. So, for example, if you have like, let's see, like in the US, for example, there's been like a huge shift from locally based news networks to like massive syndicated, internationally or nationally very distributed, but ideologically very diverse networks.
Right.
And that's like a feature of the media system rather than like a thing which individual hearers are kind of, creating, like, tailored news feeds or whatever.
Right.
And some of the roots of that are to do with just the, population increase.
Right.
So if you can have, if you can get like a larger audience, merely because there are just more listeners around, then you can afford to be ideologically more narrow and to go for like a more committed, smaller group of listeners than a larger, more diverse group of listeners.
Right.
And so one reason why, like in New Zealand, it's like less bad than it is in the US is simply because we don't really have the size that can sustain like geographically enormous, but ideologically very narrow networks, like say Fox, for example.
Right. Like, I mean, I can imagine that, say a libertarian news organization or media organ isn't going to become huge in this country because, you're right. I mean, it might be whatever percent of the population, but the population is small, and that's where the money's coming from, and the money that you might manage to generate from just appealing to, say, that quite narrow set of views isn't going to be sufficient to have a strong, powerful media organ that can dominate these different spaces, or that can, continually pump out, let's say, clickbaity or clickable information in these streams.
Yeah, so that's kind of just like a background effect of just pure scale. But there are also like legal changes, particularly in the US, for example, that have, I guess, increased or accelerated those tendencies. So, for example, in the late 80s, there was before the 80s, there was a thing called the Fairness Doctrine, which was like a legal requirement of like balanced political coverage in news reporting. So you couldn't really have an ideologically very narrow news source because you had to, you had to give some time to the opposing view. So you couldn't have like a sort of hardcore left wing or hardcore right wing major news channel.
And it's interesting too that that's looking at fairness rather than truth, because you can tell the truth all day long, right? And still only promote one view or one political, just by cherry picking facts and I've seen some really funny write-ups where they start with the same piece of news and they go through it being like reported by Fox, reported by CNN, reported by a few different organizations across the political spectrum. And it's like, there's nothing in any of the reports that's necessarily untrue, but just by focusing on certain facts or turns of phrase or just like the way they use language to describe things, ripping stuff out. If you look at the final kind of articles, you would get a completely different impression about what actually happened.
Totally. So what's implied is often as important as or more important than what's explicitly stated.
That's right.
So that was one legal change, like suspending the Fairness Doctrine, because they repealed that law in the late 80s. And then another change was there was, I think it was in 1995, they changed the Telecommunications Act, which meant that there were no longer restrictions on the size of news networks. So previously it had been heavily geared towards local news. But after they changed that, you had people like Murdoch, for example, buying up like loads and loads of stations and creating these enormous conglomerates
Right.
that were, as I said before, like geographically very distributed, but ideologically very narrow.
Right.
So just the news business model changed at that point. Now, it's interesting to point out that that's like pre-internet.
Yeah, that's right. And actually, now I remember, I mean, I think I've had this conversation or a similar conversation with someone else who did point out that the kind of rise of the huge cable networks in the pre-internet era was definitely a big shift in the level of polarization. So if you look at the graphs, like around when that happened, then the means of the, say, right and left started to drift farther and farther apart. Yeah, it was certainly a lubricant for that. Do you know why they got rid of the fairness doctrine and cut down the restrictions on the size of media organizations? I mean, I'm imagining it was under a Republican government, but I don't know.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure exactly, but it would be good to look at that.
Yeah.
But so it's interesting to note that, like, as I said, that's like a pre-internet thing. And so you actually see the beginnings of polarization in that kind of like pre-internet era.
Mm-hmm.
And so the effects of things like the internet certainly accelerate those processes, but didn't originate them. I mean, it was pretty bad even before that.
Right. And
so, so those are US examples, but like similar. The situation is also similar, like in other countries.
Right. And perhaps the fact that we didn't have so much. I mean, I can think of a few things. Like, I mean, it used to be the TV in New Zealand was 2 channels. Then we got 3. And then, maybe it became possible to get a few more on cable, but then not a big percentage of people had them. And then maybe they opened up a few more free-to-air channels that nobody watched. So I don't feel, and obviously this would be something that you could actually find out, but I don't feel like the levels of polarization are so high here as from here they appear to be in the States and perhaps also in the UK. And you also mentioned like the role that just, I suppose, the human tendency to tribalism, which has presumably evolved, or it's the way that the human animal has been living for the greater part of its existence. The effect that can have on polarization.
Yeah, so there's like a branch of social psychology called self-categorization theory, which basically it kind of studies the ways in which we just kind of naturally tend to think in these like tribal kinds of terms.
Right.
And sort of like what are the things that can make us more susceptible to tribal thinking, but also what are the effects of thinking in a sort of tribal way. So the terms that are used in self-categorization theory are like, we think in terms of an in-group and an out-group. And so the in-group is the group that we're part of, and then the out-group is the group
other.
That's like the other, or it's kind of taken to be like a threat or a rival to the in-group. Now these are sort of like just background sort of subconscious dispositions.
Sure.
I mean, we can always sort of like consciously overcome that, at a given moment. But what it does is it predisposes us to act or think in ways that we're like not able to kind of easily spot when we're sort of not paying like close attention to it.
Right.
And so this is how you get things like implicit biases and stuff.
Right.
Towards members of like different cultural groups or things like that.
Yeah, it does make sense, I suppose, from a Evo Psych point of view that someone new coming in or something new, like it probably makes more sense in terms of the survival of your tribe to just assume that they're a threat, and to
well, actually it sort of depends on like how you set up the in-group out-group category, because you can actually set it up in all kinds of different ways using different kind of framing, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, like at like a, I don't know, if you're at like a sports game or something,
Right.
The sort of visible signifiers of sort of sports team fanhood, or the songs, the clothing, and so
Right.
on, will prime you to make that the kind of salient division.
Yes.
You're either a fan of the Red Sox or a fan of the Patriots or whatever.
You're part of my tribe, or like however it's sort of bounded for the purposes of this interaction or event.
So it's so that which tribal division is important is like a contextual thing.
Yes.
Whereas in like a political context, the relevant tribal distinction might be like left wing, right wing, or something like that. Or even if it's in like a nationalistic context, the relevant distinction would be like a member of this country versus a member of a different country. But what you can do is you can actually, like, if you alter the context or if you alter the framing, you can get people to think or you can get people to treat different categories as the kind of salient category.
Right. Yeah. Well, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I was just sort of thinking like, well, if you're somewhere in the dark in your village or something like that, you hear a noise that you can't identify, a loud noise you can't identify out in the other space in the darkness, then it would kind of make sense that your first reaction would be sort of fear, right? And that could be difficult to differentiate potentially from antagonism, I suppose. But in the world that we live in, I mean, we haven't lived in that world, most of us, for a very long time. And we're living in cities surrounded by huge numbers of people, where there's constant flows of people and information and ideas. And to the degree that we have any of those, like I think so many things when you look at Evo Psych, it's like, well, it made kind of sense to do this once in a very different place, in a very different time, in a very different environment. But it's only hurting us in the modern world to behave in these ways. And we need to figure out ways of behaving that result in better consequences for everyone, such as the ones you're discussing.
Yeah, it's also important to remember that these are like predispositions rather than sort of set deterministic things.
They can be consciously overcome.
They can be consciously overcome, and we can also work on undermining those predispositions, or just sort of reducing the way they affect us, and also just like framing different kinds of categories as salient. Mm-hmm. So you can get people to identify as like, we're all humans, as opposed to identifying as like a member of this country versus a member of that country or whatever.
That's right. And I suppose there's been plenty of political and globalist movements of various kinds throughout history that have done exactly that. I like the solidarity movement, for example. That what's important is that we're workers, for example, not that you're Polish and I'm German. And he's Senegalese.
Yeah, totally.
That's really interesting. And in terms of like, what are you looking at, I suppose, producing in terms of like a thesis or work or an investigation or whatever it would be properly called, from your interests in epistemology and what we've just been discussing?
Yeah, so my own research is more kind of on misinformation.
Mm-hmm.
So in particular, I'm interested in this kind of tension at the moment, which is becoming clearer and clearer around the world, between the need to do something about misinformation and the need to maintain protections on freedom of speech. Right. So like a lot of countries like Germany, France, Singapore, for example, are putting new restrictions on certain kinds of speech that are aimed at reducing the prevalence of misinformation.
Right.
And there are also a lot of countries that haven't yet enacted anything, but which are considering it. Mm-hmm. And so the worry is that like speech regulation is kind of maybe something we could be a little bit suspicious about in general, because we have this kind of strong value in like most liberal democracies for like freedom of speech and freedom of expression and stuff like that.
Right.
But then there's also this question of like, how far does that extend? I mean,
there have been traditional limitations forever, right? The classic being yelling fire in a crowded movie theater or whatever it might be. That there's always been some speech that we've drawn a line underneath. And I suppose the question is like, where does that line need to shift somewhere? Is it fine where it is? If it does need to shift somewhere, where should it shift to? What different speech should no longer be permitted? For what reason? Blah, 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 blah. Those sorts of issues, right?
Yeah. So there are, in most countries, or in most like sort of liberal democratic countries, there are well-recognized exceptions to protections on freedom of speech. So normally we don't think freedom of speech covers like, causing a panic or inciting a riot or a stampede or something, causing harm. Normally we also think that it doesn't cover things like defamation or slander.
Right.
But it also doesn't cover certain types of deceptive commercial speech, like false advertising or false product labeling.
Yes. I mean, that makes a lot of sense too, in the sense that you could otherwise label a bottle of battery acid as Gatorade.
Yeah.
Like, what? Freedom of speech. I'm walking here.
Yeah. Totally. And actually, I think the reason why we have those kinds of protections is from earlier cases where people would sell like
snake oil.
Well, they'd sell things like antifreeze as like medicine, for example, and terrible stuff like that. So that's kind of the origins of excluding that category of speech from ordinary freedom of speech protections.
Right.
So what I want to do is to sort of take misinformation, not misinformation in general, but misinformation about specific narrowly defined types of domains.
Mm-hmm.
Like, for example, misinformation about the pandemic, misinformation about like, climate change, or whether smoking causes cancer or whatever.
Right.
And there's actually been like loads and loads of misinformation about all three of those categories.
No, I want
to just sort of say that that's also should be excluded from the freedom of speech protections.
Right. And just as a kind of technical point, how would you distinguish misinformation from lying?
I actually don't think there's necessarily like a distinction, but the important thing I'm interested in is not just like lies in general, but like when it rises to like being mass speech, or like when it has this like kind of massive public visibility, then we could say maybe it counts as misinformation.
Versus me just telling you that the sky's green or whatever when I know it isn't. That's a lie. It's just me and you. Well, that's it's an interesting distinction that I hadn't heard before. And would you categorize under misinformation the sort of thing that we were mentioning before when I said, it's possible to create a completely wrong perception without actually saying anything that's untrue?
Yeah, because what you can do sometimes is you can exploit like pre-existing false beliefs that a hearer has. Mm-hmm. So, for example, you might engage in misinformation where you say, climate change, it's just a theory, it's just a scientific theory,
right.
And you might
like gravity.
But you might be like exploiting the hearer's pre-existing false belief about like what the word theory means in science.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of I call them kind of like shell games with language, or that it's like I'm using this term, and there's a common understanding of what that term means, that that person is going to interpret the word that way. But I suppose it's almost like a Motte and Bailey sort of thing as well. But if you're pressed, you can say, oh, no, I'm using this kind of technical academic or some other definition of the word. Oh, you completely, it's like this sort of plausible deniability that politicians like to use as well. I'm saying that's another way of deceiving people without necessarily lying. Because
Yeah, you could also just be super unclear. Like you'll notice,
right.
for example, in like a lot of Trump speeches, he like interrupts himself mid-sentence, and it's just kind
Yeah.
of like this almost meaningless like jumble of like half-formed thoughts.
You know what I think he's
And it
doing?
makes it really hard to pin him down afterwards and say like, you said this.
Yeah, that's
Because
right.
he can always, because the sentence is like not a well-formed sentence. It's like a,
it's
half
post-truth
interrupted.
politics.
Yeah. So it just gives him more plausible deniability around like what it was that he actually said.
And I think, one thing that's been really unfortunate about that is that kind of, see, I think in the past, and well, okay, not always in the past, there have been, some notable cases where this hasn't been the case, but generally in liberal democracies, politicians at least try and cloak their arguments in as if they are appealing to reason, and using facts, like saying true things about the world. And I mean, there could be all kinds of spin, there could be all kinds of language shell games, blah, blah, blah. But you wouldn't get a politician saying that, the sky looked purple, looking up at it when it's blue, saying it looks purple or yellow or whatever, and just doubling down on that in the face of people pointing out that it's just manifestly not true. And, just blustering their way through having said something that's just manifestly false. And the problem is that it looks like doing that can actually work, that there are some circumstances in which you can gain political support through just taking that kind of tack, like just saying words in the moment that seem to make receptive people excited and support you, in that sort of demagogue-like fashion.
Yeah, it's called dog whistling. Yeah.
Yeah, and the concern is that it seems like, wait, this actually works, and we're allowed to do it, and it's possible to win big important elections with this strategy, and it's deranging for the people who are having to try and make sense of the world through what the politicians are telling them and what the media is writing about the politicians. It's one thing to lie occasionally, because then the media can go, oh, you have a track record of telling the truth, or at least, cloaking your arguments in reason and facts, apparently, ostensibly. But if someone's just not telling the truth all the time, it's like the media just often don't seem to know what to do with it, except for, get quite sort of frothy mouthed and write lots of angry articles. And in some circumstances, it looks like it can be effective. And would that be the sort of thing that you'd be thinking, well, maybe there should be some rules about whether or not politicians are actually allowed to do this, to have a habit of...
Yeah, it might not be about like political speech in general, because there are like strong reasons to be wary of any restriction on political speech.
Right.
But it would have to target like very narrowly defined and what I call kind of credibly settled claims, like for example the claim that climate change is occurring, or the claim that smoking kills people, or the claim that wearing a mask reduces your risk of getting the coronavirus,
sure,
or reduces your risk of transmitting it, or whatever.
Right.
So it would probably have to target like very narrowly defined claims that are like credibly settled, by which I mean like settled amongst the kind of relevant group of like trustworthy, competent experts, like by consensus. Now, obviously, we'll need to say more if we were to sort of fully flesh out this thought. We'll need to say more about, okay, what is it that makes like a consensus of experts credible and trustworthy and whatnot? And it might be the case that we should be kind of wary of over deference or deferring too much to experts, because there might be like situations in which a consensus of experts is like not trustworthy, because it arises for the wrong reasons or something.
Experts are human beings, right? And they can be ideologically captured in the same way that human beings can be in general. Yeah. And there's nothing magic about them that prevents that from happening. And also, I think a deeply unfortunate effect of the polarization that we were discussing is a reduction in the trust people have in experts, in people who are meant to have deep specialist knowledge and expertise in particular fields and disciplines.
Yeah. I mean, one really important thing with like working out who to trust and who to defer to and who to regard as like a good source of evidence is that we often are quite quick to judge speakers based on like kind of like their perceived, I guess, like not so much their competence, but just like their trustworthiness as measured by like whether they accord with the same kinds of like ethical or social values as ourselves. So by which I mean, like if you're sort of left leaning and, you know, someone's trying to convince you of something, but they're like a, you know, Southern Baptist preacher or something like that, who sort of is coming from like a completely different world from you, then even if they're perfectly competent at, you know, whatever it is that they're talking about, there's kind of like a mental barrier perhaps. And so similarly with people on the right, if they don't if they're receiving the testimony of someone who sort of doesn't accord with the kind of like, I guess, social values of that culture or that sort of branch of the culture, there's just going to be a barrier that has to be sort of surpassed to being able to sort of like trust that person. Now, obviously, these are not like decisive. I mean, obviously, there are ways in which we can overcome this and stuff. But it makes me think that like the best communicative strategies for addressing problems like you know, getting people to believe in climate change and stuff like that is to start with speakers that they already trust. You know, so don't send in some like Ivy League liberal elite, you know, like university professor to convince Republicans to believe in climate change. Like, you know, send them a Southern Baptist preacher or something. Or, you know, a person who they can see is, you know, part of their own, and whom they'll trust. And it's the same. That's just one example, but it's kind of the same across the board. You know, we sort of judge speakers based on social values before we look to the things like the expertise or the evidential values for their competence.
Yeah, it does seem deeply unfortunate to me that this has happened. And what do you? Well, I mean, I know that you've said you don't view the kind of social media feed cultivation as the major factor in the polarization that's happened, but you do see it as a contributing factor. And I guess, one, how much do you feel it contributes? And two, what do you think can be done about it?
Yeah, that's a difficult one because it's kind of like so I think it does contribute, but what it does is it doesn't like create the phenomenon that we're discussing, which is polarization, partly for the reasons that I mentioned, you know, owing to do with the fact that polarization kind of started way before social media. But it does exacerbate and kind of accelerate that and make it a lot harder to overcome, particularly because like people are kind of self-selecting. They kind of sort themselves into ideologically kind of concentrated groups, which is just like a natural thing. Like, you know, we don't like to hang out with people or talk to people that are just have, you know, ethically really different views from us. It's just really uncomfortable. So it's like a natural thing. It might not necessarily be sort of something you can blame people over. But maybe there are ways to just sort of design the networks to make it harder to do that, or just to sort of expose people to more kind of backgrounds, ideological diversity. Now, one challenge to doing that, of course, is that it's kind of hard to do that across platforms. So you will have seen recently that like a lot of like diehard Trump voters are just like leaving Facebook and just going onto some other platform now because you know, they don't like the fact that platform is cracking down on some of the misinformation. So it's kind of difficult when you've got like multiple social media platforms available.
And if you do crack, and as you say, if you crack down enough, I mean, all you need is some coder to make an app that has similar functionality, and everyone who's been cracked down on can go there, as has certainly happened with the right. I'm not so aware that it's happened with the left. I don't know. I can't think that. I mean, I could be completely wrong, but I can't think that there's any of the major social media platforms that have really cracked down super hard on the left to the point that they're like, screw this, we're going to go and make our own Facebook, our own Twitter, our own whatever. And that there's been a lot of actual movement and a critical mass of people on these new platforms that may or may not exist. But yeah, certainly on the right, we've seen that happen.
So it's just like really hard to sort of implement like a direct technological solution at the level of like platform design, because you can't just do it like internally with a given platform. You sort of have to find something that can be done across the whole landscape of platforms.
Yeah, I mean, like I understand people's reluctance to consider like globalist or transnationalist solutions, but like tax havens, it does seem to be a case that it would be really nice if you could get most of the world to kind of agree that something should probably be done about this, and for them to cooperate.
Yeah. My own like my main research is more sort of about, as I said, like targeting this specific category of misinformation, and then kind of using that as like the grounds to articulate like a new, so far unrecognized basic right, which is just a right against misinformation. And then that would be the kind of starting point for just like, not necessarily things like direct censorship, but just like better standards of like the design of like educational systems, media systems, and other kinds of institutional design that would just, discourage things like misinformation and polarization from occurring.
And it occurs to me one of the effects of the degree of interconnectedness we have now in the internet in general is just that, there've always been people with extreme views and extreme opinions that are considered extremely objectionable by the majority of a society. But the thing now is it's quite easy for those people to find each other wherever in the world they are, and to form communities that could have, maybe hundreds, maybe thousands of members, and to just to organize, to broadcast propaganda, to recruit.
Propaganda, Barney, is that what you're saying?
Yes, I was going to say propaganda, Matthew. Sorry, I just slip into my real voice occasionally. And to recruit people. And it's sort of, and that's beyond politics. That's way beyond politics. There's all kinds of ways of being objectionable besides having objectionable politics. I'm sure you can agree. But if those people find each other, because they're also normalizing their own kind of views and behavior by connecting. And I've seen some awful examples.
There's some bad stuff out there. Yeah.
And again, it's hard to see what can really be done about that, especially because those groups can get together and then politically agitate for the normalization of their extreme views.
Yeah, totally.
And in some cases, depending on the administration in the country, actually get some purchase with those kinds of arguments and political agitation.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So it's just super hard to know what to do about that.
Yeah, you can't unring the bell when it comes to very online people and very networked populations.
Yeah.
You can point to the problem and go, shit, that's a problem.
Yeah, totally.
That's my strategy. You can imagine completely utopian ways in which the problem might be solved. If things happen that will never happen. But what I kind of admire about philosophers like you, Matt, is that you are trying to, well, two things. One is that you're very carefully and very precisely trying to identify the problems, and that you're quite sort of thoughtfully and responsibly trying to come up with practical solutions to them. That, if nothing else, you get those ideas out in the world, right? And other people can encounter them who are trying to solve the same problems and think about them and either adopt them, or perhaps they might spark some further development and so on.
Yeah, I guess at least to provide like a good framework for thinking about the problems, partly, as you say, by just articulating really clearly what the problems actually are. I mean, the great advantage of, or one of the, I guess like one of the sort of things that is really like encouraged and valued in philosophy is just like precision about like just conceptual precision, like really like articulating the difference between different types of claims, or just sort of getting really clear about the nature of a problem.
Yeah. I mean, language does facilitate a high degree of precision, which we in terms of human beings very rarely achieve, but is possible. And it's good to see people with specialist training trying to, it's so easy to be excessively general, or to be excessively specific in the terms of just arguing with anecdotes, that sort of thing, as sort of people often do, and sort of hand waving and raving. But mostly it ends up looking like venting to me, that one of the things my mother used to say, which has stuck with me, she used to say this to her teachers who worked for her. They said, she was like, don't come to me with a problem unless you also come with at least one potential solution. So at least it would require them to think about the way that they could solve the problem. I mean, it may not be what they did, but they would at least have to think about how the problem might possibly be solved. Because otherwise you are just kind of venting. It's good to identify problems, don't get me wrong, but I think the predisposition of most people is to identify them and then just kind of leave it there, and then there's another step that we all need to take.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of understandable, though. I mean, a problem like this is a super complicated problem.
That's right.
It's really like multiple problems wrapped up into one. Like, what I'm trying to do is just tease out one strand of it and then give the beginnings of a framework for an answer for that.
Yeah, but it's God's work, Matt, that you're doing. You're on the side of the angels. And
gee, thanks, Barney.
I'm glad you exist. And are doing the work. Someone's asked if you have a Twitch that they can follow. Actually, well, I think we've covered quite a lot of ground and done quite well here. So we can. Was there anything else actually, Matt, that before we kind of move on at all? Were there any things that you particularly want to discuss today that we haven't even looked at or touched on?
Let's see. I guess we can just talk about whatever folks are interested in asking, maybe, and then if we've got some time, I can just talk more.
Yeah. Well, I don't think probably either of us have too much of a problem doing that. Right. So, I'll have a look and see if anyone has actually asked any questions. Well, there's one. Do you have a Twitch or any social media platforms or that people can follow you on, or kind of anything like that? Any websites where people can, keep tabs on you or your work?
Not really. I mean, I've got a Twitter that I never use. I mostly just use it to like follow other people that I'm interested in hearing from. But I'll probably start using that at some point eventually.
Okay, well let's
see if I can find that. Maybe I'll post that at the end or something like that.
Okay, cool. So you got a Twitter. And can you think of a resource that it might be good for people to check out to learn more about the things that you're interested in and have been talking about today?
Let's see. So I guess if you're interested in philosophy, a really good starting point is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It's like really, really good. It's written by philosophers and peer reviewed and everything like that. And there's like loads of stuff on there.
We used it at university when I was doing philosophy. Actually, used it quite regularly. Yeah,
that's probably the number one resource on philosophy. There's also like the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which is in some places just like better written. That is to say, it's like more a bit more accessible. There's a bit less jargon. So I usually start with that for like brushing up on some area of philosophy.
They're both very sexy .edu domains as well. None of that commercial nonsense. Okay. Well, I'll include those two links when we finally get around to posting this. At first on YouTube, I'll see if anyone else will take it. I'll shill it around. What are some other things? Just a quick look for any questions. We did just have someone agree that there doesn't really seem to be any particular major social media platform crackdown on leftists, but I suppose it might kind of depend how far left you go, right? Like you do reach a point where there's certainly people agitating for revolution and violence and that sort of stuff, and I do think that tends to get clamped down on it at least somewhat. Although I'm not aware that those people have really gone and formed their own social network duplicate copycat type platforms elsewhere and move there en masse. Okay. I mean that's cool.
Maybe what I could do is talk to you a little bit more about like the argument that I'm kind of working on at the moment with my dissertation.
Oh, please do. Go ahead.
Yeah. So mostly, like I said, what I'm interested in doing is kind of taking up this specific category of misinformation, which has to be sort of fairly narrowly and carefully defined. So it's misinformation about these like credibly settled facts that bear on certain basic interests or basic, basic interests like, our interest in not dying of a horrible plague, or our interest in like not having massive ecological collapse from climate change, or just sort of basic interests like that. And where the facts are like credibly settled by like a competent and reliable consensus of experts. Obviously, in some sense, it needs to be spelled out. And also in cases where like misinformation seriously threatens those interests by obscuring those facts.
Right.
So take that category. So what I'm interested in doing is to say that misinformation about that category is or should be excluded from the protections afforded by the right to free speech.
Yes.
And not merely in the same way that things like defamation, slander, fighting words, in some countries, hate speech, things like that. And not merely the same way that those categories are excluded from free speech protections, which is like in an ad hoc way. But actually, I want to say that this category of misinformation or this category of like exclusions from protection for misinformation, it actually like raises to the level of, as I said, like an unrecognized basic right, which is just a right against misinformation,
right?
Or at least a right against misinformation about these types of claims or these types of facts. Now, obviously, that kind of gets us into trouble a little bit, or apparent trouble, when it comes to, what about like, what about the ultimate justifications for freedom of speech, and how do those bear on whether or not we should exempt this category that I've described? So a lot of what I do in my dissertation is to sort of run through the different justifications for freedom of speech, and what I try and argue is that they all ultimately reduce to this one major justification, which is a justification that relies on this notion of like individual intellectual autonomy, like our right to think for ourselves and not like have what we think decided for us arbitrarily. But then I want to argue that misinformation actually represents like a greater threat to that kind of intellectual autonomy, at least in these cases, than speech regulation does. And so that's why exempting this category doesn't actually undermine the point of freedom of speech, even though it would in many other situations. So that's sort of like the structure of what I'm doing in my dissertation. And I can talk more about that if you want.
Well, it's raised a few questions in my head. And one of them is, would you then be saying that it is not desirable that everyone has the right to completely poison their mind and thinking with obvious lies that have been broadcast at them through mass media or something like that?
Yeah, so it's not like it's not a right that targets what hearers can do. I mean, if you want to seek out and expose yourself to misinformation, I'm not saying like, I'm not talking about preventing you from doing that.
You can't rebroadcast it. But then if you can't rebroadcast it, the person who's broadcasting it to you shouldn't have been able to do it in the first place, right?
Yeah, I mean, it might also just be like an applied policy question about, at what level the regulation would apply, like whether it would place like say, for example, like strict liability on the part of the original broadcaster for like broadcasting false statements, or whether it would also, bear upon the anyone who like rebroadcasts it. So that's just like a substantive policy question that's going to have to take into account like just various empirical and legal facts. So that's not so I'm not so much concerned about like that question. I'm more just concerned about this background question about whether there is anything in principle wrong about trying to restrict misinformation in some way. And so what I want to say is that it's actually advances intellectual autonomy, that is to say people's ability to like think for themselves, rather than damages it if we have this kind of default protection against misinformation. Yeah.
And one of the things you mentioned before, that perhaps a difference between lies and misinformation could be the level at which it's broadcast, or the kind of reach of what is actually said. So I'm presuming here you're not talking about the possibility of you and I having dinner somewhere and you trying to convince me that climate change isn't happening, and then I can summon the cops.
That's not like mass speech.
Yeah, that's right. So it's only mass speech, and so you must have done some thinking about what the threshold would be for something to qualify as mass speech in terms of having precision with the concept, right? Is it 100,000 people? Is it 1 million?
Yeah, I mean, I guess so. Yeah, that's one thing I'm still kind of working out with the dissertation, but I guess it would also have to depend a little bit on what the harmfulness of the speech is, or like what the I guess like it might be a function of two things rather than just of scale. Because if you have like an example of like super like dangerous or fraudulent misinformation, then it might be really, really bad, even if it reaches a relatively small audience.
Right.
So like, for example, like, I don't know, if you have someone who's promoting like the drinking of bleach as like a cure for coronavirus,
right.
Then even if it reaches a relatively small audience, if it reaches an audience which is likely to believe that,
yes,
then the harmfulness rather than merely the size.
Yeah. 100 people could die.
But it's it's both of them together that sort of determine the whether this is the kind of misinformation that would be targeted by.
So there's a dimension of reach and a dimension of harmfulness that you want to ascertain.
Yeah. Yeah, so there would be like a dimension of harmfulness and a dimension of scale. As I said, there would also be a dimension of whether it obscures facts that are credibly settled.
Yeah.
although obviously I need to do a lot more work, when I sort of, develop the dissertation, I need to do a bit more work about like just sort of fleshing out this notion of facts being credibly settled.
Yeah. There would have to be some threshold, because what any fact just about, you'll be able to find someone in a lab coat saying it's not the truth, right? Someone who is in some sense an expert, like they at least have, say, a PhD or something, or a master's or whatever it is. They have some mainstream kind of qualification that ostensibly credits them as an expert, but they strongly dissent with something that perhaps 98% of other experts agree with. And that might be a case where you could say, well, look, it's credibly settled. This guy's a crackpot. This tiny percentage of actual scientists, though, or qualified scientists, or whatever it might be, experts, are crackpots. We're saying it's settled because it has this much consensus, this much agreement, and so we're applying this metric to the speech in question.
Yeah, it might also be the case that if you've got a fact that's credibly settled, and it genuinely is credibly settled and not merely apparently credibly settled, that might just, and it's a fact where it's, has an important, substantial bearing on like people's lives and stuff. So like a really important fact, then it might be the case that the fact that that fact is settled could give you a reason to restrict certain types of mass speech about it, like mass misinformation about it, but it wouldn't necessarily justify like continued scientific debate about it. So it doesn't like cut off the rest of the conversation.
Yeah.
It doesn't like undermine the very grounds by which the fact was justified in the first place. I mean, it just gives you like a reason to sort of crack down on like widespread misinformation that like puts people's lives at risk and stuff.
Yeah, that's right. And because one thing that you do see in both the legal and the political realm is that when there are sufficiently strong vested interests in something that isn't true being able to be credibly claimed to be true, that and there's funding or whatever, they'll turn up some expert who may be an absolute pariah in his own expert community, but he's got a qualification. You can put him on a witness stand, you can have him speak to the Senate or the House or the ministers or whatever, that he seems say rational and in command of his faculties, and he's not wearing a backward saucepan on his head or whatever, but he's sowing doubt about the settledness of something that really is settled because of his or her credentials. So
like a good example of this in the context of like climate change misinformation is so there are various like respected physicists that kind of got allied with like the fossil fuel industry and had like a degree of independent status as physicists,
right? They can do the math,
but they weren't really like climate scientists or anything like that,
right?
And then basically the fossil fuel industry just like paid them to testify, and to engage in misinformation on their behalf, because like, oh, these are respected scientists and stuff, and then just kind of de-emphasize the fact that first of all these scientists were not climate scientists. They were physicists who had no expertise about climate science. But also they obscured the fact that like, these scientists are in the extreme minority, amongst people who talk about, amongst scientists who talk about climate change.
And there's
so the names of these figures I'm thinking of, for example, are like Fred Seitz and Fred Singer and Neil Nirenberg. If you look them up, there's lots of interesting stuff about them.
Right. Yeah, I think it was just reminding me that there is this unfortunate tendency you see sometimes with very bright people who have very deep expertise in one area to think that it's perhaps a relatively trivial matter to kind of claim authority or expertise in another domain. And that with climate science, I have actually seen that quite a lot. I mean, there was a guy I knew who was, actually two guys I can think of. One who was a medical doctor, and one who was a sort of a research scientist in a testing lab, who were both, adamant that climate change was a hoax, based on their and they're like, we're scientists. I have a scientific background. I have these qualifications, and just the feeling that somehow meant that they were entirely qualified to hold forth on this other evidence in a field that, really, they'd looked at quite superficially and kind of cherry-picked particular things to point out, well, look at the flaw in this particular study, which, could be one of 1,000 studies that was just a shit study. And there's 999 other ones that are saying, no, yep, this is what's happening. This is exactly
there's also like a deliberate technique that's often used in misinformation, particularly misinformation about scientific matters, whereby like a corporation or a big company that's interested in obscuring some hazard. So I'm thinking, for example, about like, pharmaceutical companies or fossil fuel companies or, manufacturers of like asbestos or whatever.
Yeah.
Where what they'll do is they'll fund like a huge number of very low quality studies.
Yeah.
And
that happened with tobacco, didn't it?
Yeah, this happened a lot with tobacco industry as well, where what they'll do is they'll just like fund loads and loads of studies. And then they'll look for, inevitably there are going to be like some false positives or some false negatives. Just, statistically, it's inevitable that, once in a while you'll get like a study which tells you, which doesn't provide any evidence for the link between like smoking and cancer, for example.
Right.
Sure, you might get like 100 that do provide that evidence, right. But if you don't publish those ones and you only publish the one that's favorable to you, then you can also just like distort the evidence in that way. So there have been like a lot of cases of like misinformation campaigns that have just done that.
Yeah, and I think it's it's important that people remember that one study shows nothing.
Yeah, totally.
I tend to prefer looking at kind of meta studies, although then you have to look at what were their criteria for inclusion and analysis, so on. But one study can turn up anything you want it to. You can always find one study that justifies whatever kind of crackpot opinion you want to have. But you've got to look at it at a much broader range of evidence. And I think it's the kind of error that the sort of people I was just discussing can kind of make because of their motivated reasoning and their sort of probably intellectual hubris.
There's also another really interesting tactic of misinformation, which is like sort of to defend the status quo just by like confusing people or just kind of by getting people to become like apathetic or just getting people like, where they don't know what to think about a given domain. And like a lot of misinformation campaigns in the past have tried to do that. And even today, like a lot of misinformation
there's carpet bombing.
Do that. Yeah. So like one example is, again, this is looking at the tobacco industry. What they would do is they wouldn't deny that there's a link between smoking and cancer. They wouldn't say that like smoking doesn't cause cancer or whatever. They would just say, oh, we don't know. They would just say, oh, there's just not enough evidence either way. We need more evidence, more debate. Let's just keep having the conversation.
Keep having the conversation while we sell cigarettes.
Before we actually do any regulation or do anything about this, about this alleged health hazard. And so what they did was they managed to like keep the conversation going for like decades and decades and decades. Just by endlessly calling for more evidence, right? Like well beyond the point when it was sort of credibly settled. I
mean, there's got to be a name for that as just like a trolling strategy.
Yeah,
I've definitely seen it online.
Yeah, so you actually see this. Yeah, you also see this in like modern day like political misinformation. So like for example, Vladimir Putin's like propaganda strategist Vladislav Surkov. What he does is he like funds groups, like political groups, like on both sides of the political spectrum. And usually he goes for the ones that are like the most vocal and spectacular examples of both sides. Yeah. And then just kind of gets them to like, battle it out or just kind of create this grand theatrical display in the sort of public eye. And the point is just to get people sort of so distracted and confused and kind of befuddled about what's going on that they won't pay any attention to what like Putin is actually, doing at the policy level, kind of behind the scenes. I think Trump has done sort of similar things. Just sort of intentionally creating controversy and distraction and sort of confusion as a kind of distracting device, or as a device for just sort of confusing people. So yeah, that's like another kind of angle on misinformation.
Yeah, well, I mean, how many more years have you got for your PhD, Matt?
Oh, I've got 3 more years.
Yeah, so I think that sounds like you've got plenty of stuff to keep yourself busy, as well as your teaching as well, right?
Oh yeah, so at the moment I'm teaching a course on like kind of like logic and sort of like misinformation and like rhetoric and stuff like that. And then I'll be teaching like a course that's directly on propaganda next summer. So that's what I'm doing.
And how have you found, I mean, I guess for most of, oh no, you have done some teaching before, hadn't you? Well, while you were here, you were like tutoring people and so on. But how did you find the move into, I suppose, proper classroom teaching, or teaching like larger groups of people? And I mean, was that pretty easy for you? Was it a smooth transition? Like, what were the kind of challenges and so on that you faced with that change of what you spend your time doing, I suppose, in academia?
Let's see. I mean, I guess like I'm mostly still doing sort of like teaching assistant type of stuff. So it's not like sort of lecturing at this stage. I've done some lecturing in the past, and that's pretty fun. But yeah, I mean, I guess the main thing is just sort of shifting from like teaching in a New Zealand context to teaching, first of all, in an American context, but also at this sort of like Ivy League kind of environment.
Yeah, I have wanted to ask you about that, like what's what are the kind of differences, I suppose, because you've been to university here and spent quite a long time there, and now you're at one of the premier Ivy League universities in the world. Like, what's the kind of difference in sort of culture and attitude and students and so on, that like what sort of things leap out at you coming from this perspective and going there?
Well, I sort of found like academia in New Zealand to be pretty relaxed.
Yeah.
Just sort of, a little bit less formal maybe. I don't really know exactly how much of my experience is like Harvard specific versus like Ivy League specific versus like East Coast specific versus versus sort of US specific. But at least like during my time at Harvard, I found that it's more formal, but also just like it's just a bit more kind of neurotic, I guess, like a little bit more sort of I don't know. I don't really know how to describe it.
Do you feel more neurotic, or is that something you pick up from the students, or both? Or is it just the amount of money that people are having to spend to be there, and like how tough it is to get in? Yeah,
I think it's just it just feels like such a high pressure environment,
right?
That everything just feels like such a big deal. I kind of wish everybody would just calm down a bit, but I don't know. That might also just be like my personality or something.
Right.
I don't know.
And have you met any other, I suppose, Australasians or Southern Hemispherians? Well,
there's one other New Zealander in my program.
Right.
Yeah.
And do you get on with them okay?
Yeah, pretty good.
The Marmite jar?
But yeah, I found like going to Harvard, it's pretty mainstream. Like there's not really too many alternative folks there.
Right.
But fortunately, Boston has like a really good goth scene.
Yeah.
There are something like 3 monthly nights and 1 weekly night, and then there are also like goth nights up in Salem and down in Rhode Island and and other parts of Massachusetts as well. So I've sort of found it like really good just to sort of have just to sort of have that like stuff going on like off campus.
Yeah.
Like basically when I first moved to Boston, I just went to some of the goth nights and I was just like, hey guys, I don't really know anybody. Want to be my friends?
And does I suppose the fact that you're a goth, like, has it sort of ever come up at university over there, or have students said anything to you or anything like that, or does it just pass without comment all the time?
I mean, I guess like I don't think it's really come up or anything like that. I mean, I'm pretty sure I'm the only person in my program with dyed hair.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't really. It hasn't really come up, I guess. But yeah, there are not too many people with piercings or sort of any kind of like alternative look, which is fine.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, well, I think we've had a really good chat here today. I don't think there are any more questions. I have a brief look. Well, we do have one. Someone says that they wish they knew how to whisper. Disdays, would you like to ask Matt a question? Anyone else? Oh yeah, just the question about Twitch and social media. I'll get you to give me your Twitter handle at some point, and when I upload this, I'll stick it in the info below. Maybe with just a kind of brief summary of the terrain that we have covered today. And what was the other thing I want to say? Blah, 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 blah. Oh yeah, are there any? I suppose you've like shouted out a couple of websites that you'd like to use, but just in general, are there any people or media or anything like that you'd like to promote or mention?
I can't really think of anything in particular. I noticed we've got a question down here I might address. So someone's asked, like, what do you think about I think, therefore I am?
Oh, here we go. Off you go. Boom.
I mean, I could just sort of, say some stuff about that if you like.
Stuff. Yeah, do it. Great question.
So, yeah, basically, like, so with that, as you know, that arises like in a situation where Rene Descartes was like, I want to see if I can demolish like all of my previous beliefs and convictions and stuff, and then rebuild on a foundation of like absolute certainty, like stuff that I can be completely certain in. And then he sort of thought, well, maybe I can't really be that certain of anything, because I can always think of a hypothesis or a situation in which I could believe what I believe, but it could still be wrong, like even for really basic things.
Right.
So I'll just give the background for people that aren't familiar with this. So basically, like, he imagines a situation in which there's like an all-powerful evil demon that might be giving him like hallucinations and causing him to believe that, he has hands, or causing him to believe that he's, a human being sitting in a room having some thoughts or whatever. And he says that, it's consistent with all of his perceptual experiences that, he might be, receiving these types of hallucinations and stuff like that. It's kind of like, it's kind of like the Matrix, but, in the 17th century. And then he tries to sort of like reduce it down to, okay, what's one thing that I cannot possibly reject, or one thing that I possibly cannot doubt? And so basically he says, well, I think, therefore I am. And that's kind of like a perfectly reliable argument in a way, because even if I doubt that I exist, then I'm still thinking. And if I'm thinking, well, I must exist. So I sort of can't possibly like consistently doubt that I exist. That's sort of the argument that Descartes gives with I think, therefore I am. It doesn't actually originate with Descartes. I mean, you get earlier statements of that idea in like St. Augustine, for example, but Descartes gives us the most like famous statement of I think, therefore I am. But there have been like different ways in which it's been interpreted since Descartes. So, for example, like David Hume, who is a philosopher that came after Descartes, he sort of rejected this idea that there might be any like stable, coherent notion of like a self, that is to say, like a single unified mind existing over time. That bears anything like your resemblance to like the kind of mind or person that you think you are, or think that you have. I mean, for Hume, you have this, all you have is a kind of bundle of thoughts and sensations that are just sort of happening one after the other. And there might not necessarily be like a self or a person who's like having those thoughts. It might be the case that what exists is just the thoughts, and each thought is like a separate entity, and they're just kind of stringing along in a way. So like Hume, for example, would probably say that Descartes cannot infer the existence of a thinker from the existence of thinking. All he can do is infer the existence of thinking.
Right.
So really what he thinks, really what Hume would say about Descartes is, it's not I think, therefore I am, it's I think, therefore thinking exists. But there might not be any like I or self that's like doing the thinking or which unifies the thinking in some way. So that's like one response to I think, therefore I am. I don't know if that's if that's interesting.
That's very interesting. I imagine there are many responses, however.
Yeah. I think that one's got something to it. I mean, I think it is kind of like an extra step if you want to infer the existence of like a unified self or a thinker who's doing the thinking merely from
more work to do.
Yeah. And there might be ways to do that, but it seems like the I think, therefore I am argument is a little bit hasty in that way. I noticed someone else has asked, what's your favorite type of philosophical view in relation to literature? Mm-hmm. So do you mean like literature as in like fiction, perhaps?
I think they mean hermeneutics. That, say, for example, there was close reading, and now, often it's common to take a more deconstructionist view to analysis of literature and blah, blah, blah. If you had any... Yeah, like Disdays is studying as well, and she's a would you describe yourself as a nihilistic deconstructionist, perhaps, Disdays? I mean, we didn't even really get into the effect that kind of postmodernism and continental philosophy has had on the humanities outside, of course, philosophy, where analytical philosophy still dominates the academy. But you go ahead and respond to that if you'd like.
Are you asking me or are you asking
Disdays? Sorry, I'm asking you, Matt.
Oh, cool. Yeah, so I guess like just sort of one background piece of information is so in like the 20th century in like the English speaking world, it's normally thought that there are two kind of major traditions of philosophy, one of which is what we call analytic philosophy, which has kind of predominated in like the US and the UK, where it's sort of like that view of philosophy aims at like being very kind of clear and precise in the analysis of language, and it sort of borrows techniques from like mathematics and formal logic, and sort of regards philosophy as kind of continuous with science. So that's analytic philosophy. But then there's also like continental philosophy, which is kind of based in the philosophical traditions of France and Germany, where it views philosophy as sort of continuous with literature and sort of part of this like meaning making, meaning constructing, sort of ever changing, not fully objective kind of project. And so continental philosophers are usually sort of skeptical of objective meanings or objective values, or they're interested in the role of context and culture and sort of the role of the person who's doing the interpreting and sort of constructing the meaning of the of what's being interpreted. But I should note there's also actually a third tradition which is hardly ever discussed, which is the tradition of what's called pragmatism. And so this originates in
very popular in America, isn't it?
Yeah, it originated in the work of William James and Charles Sanders Peirce, who were both American philosophers in the late 19th century. And I feel like that offers like a really interesting kind of middle ground slightly between the two traditions that I mentioned. So with the pragmatists, what they're interested in is like the relationship between the meaning of something and its practical or normative consequences. So that is to say, like they would analyze the meaning of a term like chair in terms of like the function of the chair or the sittability of the chair or something like that. And purely in terms of its consequences for action. That's one example. And so that's kind of like I feel like that's an interesting sort of, that's like a way that breaks with the like analytic tradition of thinking about objective meanings, because the pragmatist can be receptive to changes in meaning and more like kind of contextual based variations of meaning, and also interpreter based variations of meaning, because the meanings of terms and the meanings of expressions can come down to the particular practical consequences of those expressions for the individual inquirer. Like really radical pragmatists will do the same thing with the notion of like truth, and they'll say there is no such thing as truth beyond like what works, what's practical, and whatever. That's like a pretty extreme view, and even like modern day pragmatists don't usually go that far. They're usually more interested in pragmatism about the meanings of terms rather than pragmatism about like what's actually like, you know, true out there in the world. Right. But yeah, that's another position that sometimes people hold, and that kind of gets more towards the continental tradition and the sort of skepticism towards objective truth.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I'd heard of pragmatism, but I didn't think of it as a middle ground between analytic and continental philosophy. So that's food for thought. I do have a whispered question for you, Matt. Bonobo, or actually Bodobo, but I call her Bonobo. Her question is, do you think we're living in a simulation? And if we were, what would be reliable evidence for that claim? And what would be sort of arguments against it? Blah, 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 blah. I have some opinions about this, but, you know, go ahead, Matt. Are we living in a simulation? Yes or no?
Well, if we were living in a simulation, then maybe the simulation would be like simulating me telling you this. And so I guess the simulation is going to tell you that, no, we're not living in a simulation, but that's exactly what I would say if I was simulated. So that's probably not a very satisfying answer.
Yeah. I mean, even the kind of arguments against it that I've heard, you can still imagine a scenario in which the simulation could kind of trick you. Like, for example, based on what we understand of physics, the amount of computation it would take to simulate something at the scale would be, you know, would exceed the bounds of the universe and blah, 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 blah. But it's like, well, a simulation could just tell us that these were the laws of physics, blah, blah, blah. So, yeah, whatever. If you want to believe it, go ahead.
It might also be the case that like we can't work out decisively whether we're in a simulation or not, but maybe we just have to like believe that we're not, just for kind of for like our own sanity or something like that.
For pragmatic reasons, I think it's probably better. Well, it's probably better to believe we're not in a simulation and that we do have free will. And we haven't even really gotten into free will, but it is one of the things.
I can talk about free will if you want. I don't know how
there
much.
Was a question.
I've got loads of time if you want to keep talking, but it's up to you.
I have some time. I probably have about another maximum kind of 40 minutes before I really need to. I can't show up to work like this. Is the problem. So I need to kind of sort that out. But yeah, there was a question if you believed in free will or if you're more of a determinist. And I'd probably also ask, are you more of a compatibilist, perhaps? Seeing as I know that's the most popular choice of the contemporary philosopher. What would you like to say about that? Response to that?
Yeah, so just to explain the terms for like hearers who are not familiar with them. So determinists generally think that like everything that happens, including our own actions, are ultimately caused or determined by causes that are like ultimately outside of us. So there might be things like, you know, the laws of physics, you know, tracing ultimately all the way back to the origins of the universe, such that if you just sort of, you know, had the universe at that original state and then you had all the laws of physics and you like pressed go, the laws of physics together with the universe at that original state would then entail all the things that happen. That's sort of like the determinist view. And then normally what you have are what's called hard determinists who think that that means we don't have free will, because there's this idea that you only have free will if you've got the ability to do otherwise than what you actually did. But then, if everything's kind of determined, then you never have the ability to do otherwise. And so the thought is, okay, so maybe we don't have free will. So that's kind of like the determinist position. And then the alternative to that are what are called libertarians. And I don't mean political libertarians. I mean a completely different meaning of the word, which is metaphysical libertarians. And so they generally think that we do have free will and we are morally responsible for our actions simply because we are the ultimate causes of them. So libertarians think that we're like an exception kind of to certain kinds of laws of nature or certain kinds of laws of physics. Not all of them. Like we're not like, we can't like defy gravity and stuff like that. So they think that there are constraints on what we can do, but they still think that we're ultimately the causes of what we do. That view is really popular in, like, for example, like in Catholicism and stuff like that, and other religious traditions. So those are sort of like the two background rival views. But there is, as you said, there is this like third option, which is really popular. I mean, actually, there are sort of four options. One of them, which I'll just quickly outline, is not defended by that many people, but it's sort of this idea of like hard indeterminism, which is the idea that, okay, ultimately, according to the hard indeterminists, things aren't ultimately caused by physical laws and stuff, but that means that they're ultimately random. And so that means they're not up to us either, because, you're not, just in the same way that you're not responsible for, rolling a dice and getting a 6 because you couldn't control the outcome. The hard indeterminist thinks that you're not responsible for what you do because it's ultimately the product of, random chance. That's like another alternative. But you mentioned compatibilism, so I can talk about that if you want.
Yeah, I'd be interested actually. Something I tried to get my head around with mixed results.
Yeah, so compatibilism is the view that we should sort of adopt a slightly different notion of free will or moral responsibility that gets away from this idea that we're only responsible for an action if we could have done otherwise. And so there are a couple of different versions of compatibilism. But I'll just give you one really kind of famous argument that is often used to kind of motivate this idea of compatibilism. Mm-hmm. And so this comes from a philosopher called Harry Frankfurt. And so basically, Harry Frankfurt describes a thought experiment in which you've got a person who goes and decides to go and kick her dog. Mm-hmm. And she just decides to kick the dog and she goes and does it. And what she doesn't know is that there is like this evil mad scientist who has put a device in her brain that allows the mad scientist to control her actions. And as it happens, the mad scientist would have made her kick the dog if she hadn't already decided to do it. Now, in this example, it's important to note that the mad scientist is not actually controlling her actions. Like the mad scientist has got the control box and just like isn't doing anything with it.
Right.
The important thing is that the mad scientist would step in and make her kick the dog were it not for the fact that the person already decided to kick the dog just completely of her own volition. Now, the thought is, or the question is like, okay, so is the woman responsible, morally responsible, or ethically responsible for kicking the dog? Given that she couldn't have done otherwise. Like if she decided not to, the mad scientist would have just made her do it anyway. Mm-hmm. And in this situation, like a lot of people have the intuition that she actually is responsible because she did it as the result of her own decision, even though she had like kind of no alternative, because if she decided otherwise, the mad scientist would have forced her to. And so this is generally taken to motivate the idea that free will or moral responsibility doesn't require having these kinds of alternatives necessarily. Like we can be responsible for stuff even when we don't have alternatives. That's sort of the thought. And then so you have like different types of compatibilist theories that sort of take that idea in different ways. But one type of compatibilist theory is this idea that we can have free will when we perform actions that kind of stem from like our real selves. That is to say, what we really want, or what we really, just like what our real personalities are and stuff like that. And it might be the case that, okay, sure, we're not ultimately responsible for our real selves or our real personalities, because they can be like caused by things like genetics and background and whatnot. But we can still be responsible for everything like from that point on, like everything that comes after, or everything that's caused like via ourselves. So that's like one compatibilist theory, and that gives us a kind of middle of the road, I guess, between the libertarian view and the determinist view. So yeah, I don't know if that's a good explanation, but that's one answer.
And so, yeah, so would it be fair to say that the free will in that understanding would be where your will is free so long as your actions track your desires?
Yeah. Now there's
that
another.
You can be held morally responsible for them anyway.
Yeah. Now there's a kind of a slight variation on that, which is there's also this theory which says that, and this is actually Frankfurt's own theory, which basically says that it also has to be the case that you have like a certain kind of consistency between like your first order and second order desires. Mm-hmm. So your first order desires are like what you want or what you prefer. Right. And your second order desires are like what you want to want, or what you prefer about your own preferences. And it might be the case that acting freely involves acting in accordance with the second order desires rather than just the first ones. So for example, consider the example of like a smoker who wants to quit smoking. And they don't want to smoke, or they do want to smoke, but they don't want to smoke. That is to say, they have the inclination to smoke, but they really like wish that they didn't. Right. And then they go and smoke anyway, but they kind of feel bad about it, and they wish that they could have just gotten control of themselves. Now, according to this theory that we're considering, according to the kind of compatibilist theory, then they haven't acted freely, even though they did what they wanted. They haven't acted freely because they didn't do what they wanted to want. So that's sort of the that's this kind of like two-level version of compatibilism.
Is it a fair criticism of compatibilism to say that it's essentially redefining what most people would understand by the idea of having free will? And that, well, I mean, that's one criticism I've sort of heard of it, and that perhaps it would be better if it used a different term to avoid the confusion that people often experience when they encounter the theory.
Yeah, so I guess so that is a criticism which people often put against compatibilism. Mm-hmm. They think it kind of gives us this like unsatisfying substitute for free will rather than actual free will.
Right.
But perhaps what we could do is we could kind of resort back to what I mentioned before, which was the pragmatist theory of meaning, and to say that the meanings of the concepts are sort of defined by like their practical usefulness, or like their practical consequences for action. Mm-hmm. Now, according to that theory of meaning, the concept of free will doesn't have an objective meaning. It doesn't have like this meaning that we can either accept or discard. According to the pragmatist, the idea of the concept of free will is just a tool that we can restructure or reshape according to how we want to use it. So it might be the case that we're not necessarily like abandoning some valuable concept, the concept of free will, and then kind of adopting an unsatisfying alternative. It might be the case that there is no concept of free will that's independent of the concept we choose to use and the way we choose to structure it. And so if it turns out that a compatibilist theory, if it turns out that if a compatibilist concept of free will is like more useful in like structuring our lives and assigning moral responsibility for actions, if it's more useful in that way, then according to this like background pragmatist theory of meaning, then that's what free will is. There's no objective fact beyond that.
I suppose, unfortunately, people don't usually have a lot of success changing meanings of words by decree. It's interesting to hear you describe that, because I can see how it does get quite close to the sort of postmodern concept that all meaning is just kind of carried by language, and that all these meanings that are attached by language and these kind of self-referential networks of signs compete with each other for dominance, and that in this case, in certain sorts of postmodern analysis, you could look at that as being the attempt to assert a reason to ascend this new meaning, or this new network of meaning attached to the phrase free will in the dominance of concepts and the hierarchy of concepts.
Yeah, I mean, so one way in which the pragmatist theory of meaning could differ from the postmodernist theory of meaning is that for the postmodernist, like, kind of everything is up for grabs. There's no foundational set of concepts that we use to define the meanings of any other concepts. Like, everything's just kind of interdefining in a kind of network. It's like, when you look up the meaning of a word in a dictionary, what do you get? Other words. And then so you have to sort of look up those words, and then everything's just kind of, eventually you might just get back around to the original word that you started with. And it's kind of just this interdefining network. That's the sort of deconstruction or postmodern kind of approach. But the pragmatist theory of meaning could differ from that, because they can say, well, actually, no, there is this, what we've said is that there's the meaning of a term just reduces down to its practical or normative consequences. So we might have a sort of special category of concepts, like namely evaluative concepts, which are the kind of baseline, which are used to construct meaning for everything else.
And whose job is it to establish the meanings for them?
Well, it might just be like a collective, social enterprise. Like, it might be the case that we're constantly restructuring the meanings of words for various political purposes.
I think we could just survey people. I've often thought about something like that idea, where we just, because if you take any word and you ask people about what it means, you get sort of slightly different responses. But you could look at some sort of statistical distribution of those sorts of responses, right? How they connect. And that could give you some sort of a normative framework for working with, labels, for working with language, and for demonstrating what their connection to meaning and practical effect and practical use and communication. Because I think everyone agrees that communication happens, right? I mean, we're communicating now. And so we must, our networks must be, if not identical, at least relatively closely shared, in order to make communication possible. And that happens, it's not just me and you who have this magical ability. It's like we go out into the English-speaking world, and we tend to have it with most people. So that there must be these kind of these normative networks of interconnection of meaning that I think it would be possible to actually assay them.
Yeah, I think it's important, though, to be wary of ways in which meanings can be obscured or distorted intentionally by for particular purposes. So, for example, you look at the language that's used in propaganda, where it sort of appeals to kind of shared political values like freedom, equality, liberty, things like that. Where the meanings of those terms is deliberately kept like super vague, and actually it's useful for the politicians to keep those meanings really, really vague, so that they can be, used in various ways. Like one thing you can do with a term is just keep it so vague that, what you're saying, if you're a politician, can just be interpreted by different audiences to suit their own.
I mean, in general, they love those kinds of statements, right? Because
totally.
They're not saying things that are so nailed down that they could actually lose support with some groups, and that a skillful politician will say things that all the kind of groups they want to appeal to, they know will be able to interpret them in ways that suit what they want to do. And you see that an awful lot, especially with one place I see it a lot is more kind of centrist politicians, or center left, center right, who are trying to say things that don't completely alienate people who are quite a long way away on their spectrum, so that a center left might sound superficially like they're, say, repeating some rhetoric of quite far left, but they've subtly shifted the language so that it can be interpreted by, say, centrist, center left, progressive left, far left, in a way that none of them are going to find completely unpalatable.
Yeah, I mean, there's also the phenomenon of dog whistles, which is like when you have a term that is used where it has like a kind of relatively neutral meaning for most hearers, but it has like a special meaning for like a small group of like ideologically very committed hearers.
That's right.
And it's used by a speaker to signify kind of sympathy or allegiance towards those hearers. Mm-hmm. So, for example, like during the Black Lives Matter protests and stuff, some politicians and news anchors use the word mob quite a lot, and that's like a well-known dog whistle that's used to signify kind of a very sort of right-wing allegiance by sort of. And it sort of features heavily in this rhetoric of sort of portraying like left-wing protesters as like this undisciplined rabble.
Right.
Where the word mob might have, like, just for a casual hearer, it might not have so much of a loaded meaning. I mean, it sort of kind of does a little bit, but it's because it's used in this like really well-established way in like a lot of right-wing rhetoric. If you're speaking to an audience that's like kind of diverse, what you can do is you can signify to a specific segment of that audience that you're like, especially sympathetic to them, or especially well aligned with them. So that's basically the notion of a dog whistle. It's a thing with, this sort of neutral meaning, but also like a special, that sort of signifies like a special kind of allegiance.
Yeah. And you're quite right that I've seen that quite a lot with the far right, particularly who I mean, I think some of them are quite sort of, what's the word? I think they actually enjoy taking fairly anodyne terms or expressions or symbols and then creating in-group meanings for them that can then be kind of dog whistled to from farther in the leftward direction on the right end of the spectrum.
Yeah.
Yeah, good call.
Yeah, so I guess like just to sort of tie together some of the stuff we've just been saying, I guess maybe we could say that like, okay, sure, meaning is this kind of socially constructed, socially contested thing. And, the meanings of words and stuff is not like an objective thing necessarily, or it can be sort of, up to the way it's used and can be a tool for various purposes. But we should be like very wary and suspicious of attempts to kind of control that, by like powerful groups.
Yes, that's right.
Like another example is also just like substituting certain phrases for other phrases in popular discourse. Mm-hmm. Like the phrase climate change was deliberately engineered or popularized as part of like a PR campaign by the fossil fuel industry, because it sort of sounds less scary than global warming. Like global warming sounds kind of scary a little bit, but climate change just kind of sounds like you're, I don't know.
It's getting well, it doesn't even say that
seasons are changing or something like that, right? Or you're just kind of going from one part of the country to another.
Yeah, right. Yeah, went to Dunedin, climate change.
Yeah, totally happened. So, and it's kind of like amazing how successful they were at doing that. Like I use the word climate change myself, and a lot of people do. So it's like amazing how sort of successful they were at popularizing that phrase.
Yeah, I mean, I think I use it too, and I think it feels like I'm going to upset fewer people while still saying the same thing, or while still talking about the same thing. Actually, it was interesting that came up because there was a phrase like the word socialism, right? Like it's quite, I mean, not to get too into it, but the word socialism has quite a tortured and strange history, and it's been used by different countries and different people in different countries in different ways. And in America, in a lot of ways, the word socialism is kind of tainted in their popular consciousness, especially in the right wing, in a way that it isn't so much in, say, the Scandinavian countries and Australia, New Zealand, Canada, blah blah blah. And someone was saying to me the other day that because the problem is, like, sometimes you can have politicians with great ideas, but they're kind of non-starters in terms of getting elected because they're using the word socialism to describe them. And someone was suggesting to me what they should talk about instead is investment capitalism. In the United States. It's like, and like, rather than saying we're going to socialize mental health costs, for example, it's like, no, we're going to invest in people with mental health issues. We're going to fund their treatment in order that they can ultimately become more productive and beneficial to the whole of society, blah, blah, blah. We're going to invest.
Just changing the language is really, really powerful.
That's right. And, you can sell this concept that would have been anathema to a group of people, and get them actually quite excited and worked up. But I mean, I think a social investment was another one that I saw. I mean, there's a few different theories like that, but I mean, I think it's an example of what you're talking about, and maybe something that skillful politicians can use for the forces of good.
Yeah, I mean, this also relates to what I was saying before about how people kind of judge speakers based on whether they accord with the sort of whether they sort of share the same kinds of social values and stuff before they look to things like the expertise or the purely kind of evidential considerations and stuff. People sort of look to, are you the member of my tribe? Are you speaking the same language as me? So this is kind of another version of that, so sort of to convince people and to kind of create change and stuff, one strategy is to sort of, use speakers that people can relate to based on their existing categories.
And language.
But another one is to use the same language as them.
Cool. Well, I really probably do have to start thinking about getting going, Matt. But it's been really enjoyable to talk to you, as it always is. And hopefully we can catch up in Meet Space pretty soon and continue the conversation. Is there anything you'd like to say before heading out?
No, really. This has been a great conversation. It's been really interesting.
Yeah, good fun. We got some really good questions too, which I was really pleased about. So, you take care of yourself. I'll see you quite soon. We'll hang out, get coffee, or some other warm beverage. And
cool.
I hope you have an enjoyable rest of the day. All right, see you.
Cool.
And as for everyone else, thanks a lot for coming along to my first podcast. The first podcast of Bants in the Belfry, episode 1. You're all here on the ground floor. I will try to get this all edited and uploaded probably to YouTube in the next day or two. We'll see how much work I end up having to do. I'm actually going to wrap this up with a poem. I thought that it'd be like, I seem to end my regular streams with poems, so why not end these ones with poems too? And this is a poem that I actually wrote about Matt and about the experience of living with Matt. Probably, a year or two, I think, after we'd stopped living in the same house. But it is called Mr. Macdonald. Mr. Macdonald lives on a hill in a house with 3 cats and French toast on the grill. Wears a hat black and tall as an old chimney pot, the tie that is tied by an Englishman's knot. Mr. Macdonald, he sits with a book that is plump with philosophical gobbledygook. He reads to the cats and the rats they have caught, who, enthralled by the drawl of his edifying thought, flop hither and thither, scratch merry on thither, yowl plaintive to heaven, their withers a dither. In rodential, felinential tones of a child, claim their fine furry faces, Bexley beguiled by Mr. Macdonald, bed till 3, by Mr. Macdonald, addicted to tea, by Mr. Macdonald, bacon maker divine, by Mr. Macdonald, begowned all the time. Every night in that house on the hill with the cats sits Mr. Macdonald with whitening spats and darkening hair that grows curly and long as he thinks upon thinkers and whistles this song.